I'm better now. Can you hear me? Is this working? I'm sorry about February. I am back. Hello. Right. There's a fiendish logic to today's agenda. So we started with passions. I'll talk about failure, and then some people are going to talk about success. It's working. So it seems appropriate that before you're going to hear two very, very compelling stories about effectiveness after me. So I'm slightly the commercial break before you get to the main event. So it's probably appropriate that I'll talk about really failing before people talk about really succeeding. So how to fail, or how not to fail, or why there is no audience for what we make. I'm a big believer that effectiveness is an input into the creation of strategy and communications, not something you leave for a post-audit process you leave for effectiveness award. So this is a slightly intolerant, highly opinionated, but evidenced rant about some of the assumptions that get in the way of effectiveness. I should say that the two cases you're going to see fantastically avoid all of these. So let's see where we're going. So it's going to sound a bit bleak at first. I'm going to sound a bit like the Grim Reaper of advertising, talking about the recipe for failure. But trust me, understanding the recipe for failure will eventually set us free to do great stuff. So what I've got to share with you this morning, I've got some numbers. It's a lie, I've got quite a lot of numbers. I've only got one piece of work to show you, which is at the end. So there is there's a reward for sort of sitting patiently through lots of numbers. I don't have any slick, those sort of lovely prefabricated agency case studies, and then the conversation started and the YouTube numbers click through and all that sort of stuff. The good news is I haven't got those today, but there is, as I said, there's a bit of good news at the end of today's presentation. So let's think about the language of modern marketing, whether it's in client land or whatever flavor of agency land we're talking about. Oh, this works better when I put it nearer my face, doesn't it? I just discovered. Obviously, we've, for decades, talked about the audience, a group of people assembled here to, like today, to listen to our content. We, in the last sort of couple of years, have got accustomed to talking about fans. We are used, in some circles, to talking about commitment and relationships and engagement and even love. See how this agenda is working brilliantly. It's couldn't have made this up. All of this is the language of consumers giving a shit. Now, this reminds me, I gave a version of this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and one of the audience members, one of the pieces of feedback was that Martin swears a lot. I'm from England, I can't help myself. So there'll be apologies for the sensitive ones. This is the language of consumers actually giving a shit about what we make. There are some uncomfortable truths to come. Here's the fantastic news. It's all rhetoric, no evidence. No evidence, which is why I brought some numbers with me to show you how it is rank bullshit. If you are, as a marketeer, committed to the objective of failure, then I suggest you take these pieces of advice. I'd start with the assumption that people care a lot about brands, and that actually lots of people care about lots of brands, and they care a lot. So I'd start with that assumption. So the basis of a failed marketing plan is assuming that people care. I'd probably go on another key plank of a failed communication strategy or marketing endeavor of any kind. I'd assume that my customers, people out there, want to have a relationship with my brand. That's also a key vital element for failure. On top of which, I'd actually assume that a certain proportion of my audience, those we call fans, are my most vital consumers. And servicing their needs is the most important thing I can do, and getting more of those is the most important thing I can do. That's also a very useful element in any plan for failure. I'd assume, since that's kind of new, the idea of the participation idea, sort of giving consumers stuff to do in our communications content, I'd make damn sure that I'm assuming that everybody wants to take part a lot deeply. And I'd, of course, key plank of any plan for failure is I'll assume that people will find my content, because obviously they really care about brands. So there's sort of some key tenets of a failed marketing plan. I'd also assume that depth of engagement, giving people lots of things to do, getting people really involved in my communications and brand, is more important than breadth. That depth of interaction with my brand is more important than the breadth of interaction it creates. Key element in a plan for failure. I'm personally an expert on failure. So in some quarters, you get that sort of slightly, I can't quite see you here because the light's in my face. So some of you might be having this expression, what the fuck is he talking about? What? How can that possibly be a plan for failure? It all seems so reasonable, doesn't it? So I'm going to rehearse the data. I'm going to show you the data that demonstrates that I'm not just simply making this up. And I'll offer a tiny glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel so you don't all go out and commit suicide. I promise you won't go and commit suicide. I promise it'll make your lives better and more interesting and more exciting, and yes, eventually more effective. Let's start with the assumption about people caring about brands. I think the rhetoric of consumers caring about brands says more about the psychology of marketing departments than it does about the psychology of consumers. It reveals more about our own need to feel significant than the real relationship people have with brands. But it's an easy piece of rhetoric to trot out. Here's an example, and I apologize if the author of it is here today or somebody from that said company works here, but I stand by my words. This is for Domestos. It's a household bleach, yeah? So it's not exactly the most exciting of products you could use. I discovered this on the iTunes App Store. I was looking for something else, but it was so extraordinary. I have to share it with you. The descriptor that comes with this app. Welcome to the Domestos Germ Buster app. Play the Germ Buster game to destroy those menacing nasties, those germs, that lurk in your home, and learn about the benefits of Domestos over thin bleach. Right, so, this is gamification run rampant, right? So there's an app, it's a game where you learn about how Domestos can kill germs. I'm sure it's true in most parts of the world still, sadly, that the majority of household tasks are still conducted by women. Grindingly boring, dull, unforgiving tasks that they get little thanks for at the end of the day, other than the sort of the pride and satisfaction of a clean and tidy house. It's arduous, and it's also unpaid work, we should say. I am sure that during that hard day when she's cleaning the toilets and the bath and making the dinner and all the rest of it, that there's nothing she wants to do in the spare precious 10 minutes she has is, rather than maybe watch a bit of her daytime soap and have a cup of tea, she would rather play the Domestos app. Right. What the fuck was that marketer thinking about their audience? I'll tell you what they thought. They thought that their consumer cared about their brand. Cared enough not to have a cup of tea, but to fiddle around playing with some game. Good Lord. Right, I use these presentations to vent a lot. I find these experiences quite cathartic, so I may go off the deep end. So, but here's the evidence, right? So there's a marketer getting it horribly wrong already. have a look on iTunes. I can guarantee you that the number of downloads is probably, in single digits. Bloody well should be. But the truth of the matter is, most people don't know very much about the brand they currently buy and currently consume. Fact, 50% of all knowledge about a brand, that might be, for example, in the case of Heineken, that it is a beer, or that it is a European import beer, if you're not living in the Netherlands, or it comes in a green bottle or has a red star, is held by just 20% of its consumers. 50% of knowledge about a brand is held by 20% of consumers, which means that 80% of a brand's user base know little or nothing at all about a brand. They'll know that Heineken's a beer. That's it. If consumers are that into brands, why are they spending so little attention learning about brands? This evidence should tell us that learning about brands is not important to consumers. It's not that important. 80% of people know very, very little about the brand they are buying. What about the other brand, the brand they are buying? Don't take my word for it, take Facebook's word for it. This is Paul Adams. I'm sure you've all rushed out and brought his slim and breezily written paperback book grouped. And Paul observes almost every app built for for a brand on Facebook has practically no usage. And he observes that heavy, immersive brand experiences on Facebook are not how people engage and interact with brands. As he puts it, heavyweight experiences, those that sort of ask a lot of consumers either in time or in cognitive effort, fail because they don't map to real life. They don't map to real life because people don't care that much about brands. Facebook is an interesting sort of barometer of people's relationship with brands. So we're all familiar with we've gone beyond just sort of fan counting, and now we're looking at the engagement metric people are talking about. 0.5% of fans are talking about that brand on Facebook right now. 0.5%. What does that tell you about all those fans? Well, they didn't really care about it that much. So much for the rhetoric of engagement. They're self-declared fans, and they're not engaging that much. That's not a comment on Facebook. That's a comment on the relationship that people have with brands in the real world. People don't have a relationship. So let's talk about this. People don't have a relationship with your brand. It's the other metaphor of marketing that's sort of gotten in the way of reality. It's a metaphor. It's not real life. The vast majority of consumers in any market have multiple relationships. Now, unless you're sort of into the swinging scene, that doesn't particularly feel like a relationship with me. That feels like sort of cruising for all sorts of other pleasures and satisfactions. Might come as a shock to some that 72% of Pepsi drinkers also drink Coca-Cola. The vast majority of Adidas buyers also buy Nike. And so on, and so on, and so on. The idea of brands having sort of mutually exclusive tribes is a fiction unsupported by purchase data. It's just bollocks. It makes us feel fabulous, the idea of sort of consumers orbiting around brands, but they don't. Horrible, uncomfortable truth of the matter is, as Andrew Ehrenberg said decades ago, your consumers are just somebody else's consumers who occasionally buy you. You don't own your consumer, you share them, which begins to feel like a very different kind of relationship, because I'm not sure who in the room would want to share their girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, or wife. What kind of relationship does that feel like? Slightly open and probably not terribly committed. Relationship is a metaphor. Truth of the matter about human relationships is they require massive processing power to sustain and nurture and build and understand. That's why we have a really big brain. And the more neuroscientists are understanding the mysteries of the human brain, the more they're beginning to understand quite how much of that processing power is required for human interaction, is built for human interaction. So we have 1 billion neurons, about 1 million billion connections between them, each firing at 10 times per second. Now you have to build a supercomputer to even get close to that kind of processing power. And that processing power is built to sustain human contact and human communication, interactions, and relationships. And human relationships are far more complex than any brand relationship, because they actually involve all the time building really complex mental models, which we don't really do in brands. So I'm going to give you a typical mental model that we half-consciously do every single day of our lives. Oops, let's go back. So I think, me, Martin, I think that you guys think that I'm worried that you know that I have no idea what I'm talking about. 5 levels to that mental model of me anticipating what you think, I think, you think, you think. Right? That's why we have all that processing power. That's why relationships are interesting, and that's why they're sometimes really complex and fraught with complexity and difficulty. But they're dynamic and complex. I don't think brand relationships quite involve that level of processing power. Truth of the matter is relationships, human relationships, are a matter of life and death. They are a matter of life and death. We know that people with strong social networks, so well-developed social lives and strong relationships within them, actually live longer. So human contact and social life is important to living. In fact, one of the great predictions of both depression and suicide in people is having very weak social networks. You just live less and live shorter. Unlike kind of brands, right? I mean, I know they make life interesting and fun, but I'm not going to die if I'm not going to have a shorter life if my favorite brand disappears. So the fact of the matter is, this idea of relationship is a horrible metaphor that's gotten in the way of actually understanding the truth of people's interactions with brands. In fact, the relationship people have with brands are thin compared with the complexity and diversity and depth of human relationships. Our brand relationships are wafer thin. Don't trust me. Trust this dude. And by the way, relationships are free. Transactions are not. And if you can't distinguish between a transaction and a relationship, then all sorts of stuff goes horribly wrong. My friend will give me advice for free, not charge me for it. At the end of the day, brands are there to extract money out of people. My friends are not there to extract money out of me. These are business relationships. These are transactions. There are probably lots of people in a certain part of Amsterdam sort of confusing what is a transaction for a relationship. Present company accepted. This is the CMO of Mars. So they're not the most sentimental of companies, you know, not all butterflies and flowers, as somebody said earlier this morning. Bruce McCall observed, most of us go through life finding it hard enough to have good relationships with the real people in our life, let alone all the brands we buy. It's hard enough to have a relationship with a human being, and we're kind of expecting people to have relationships with all, you know, dozens of brands in our portfolio. Utter nonsense. People don't have a relationship with you. It's not a person. It's a metaphor. So, what's love got to do with it? We'll talk a bit more about that sort of nonsense later. Okay, so people don't really care that much about brands. And it's not a real relationship. It's just a pretend one. Now let's talk about this sort of other fiction of modern marketing, the idea of the fan. Again, I think our fascination with the fan as marketeers reveals more about our own psychology than our sort of grasp of consumer behavior. This one irks me. I'm going to remember to breathe during this bit. Oops. Some of you may have seen this before. This is Nielsen data for Fructis, the large hair care brand. It's US data. This looks at the distribution of annual purchase frequency. What do you see immediately? That most of the consumers are buying it once a year. Most of Fructis's consumers are buying it once a year. And those fans, presumably, who are the guys who are buying it 9 times a year, how much sales revenue do you think they're contributing? Let's have a look at an even bigger hair care brand and compare Fructis with Pantene. What if Fructis wanted to be the size of Pantene? What would it need to do? Exactly. Recruit millions of people to buy it once a year. Just once. And a few people to buy it just a little bit more often. I'm not saying no brand wants fans, all brands want some, but most of the time you want people who buy you just a bit. We should, as marketers, all be familiar with that distribution of purchase frequency because we've observed it for 50 years across every category. Negative binomial distribution. I'm sure we all know NBD by heart, but the sort of number of planners I come across who've never seen it is slightly tragic. What's the average purchase frequency of Coca-Cola in the United Kingdom? So it's a big brand. Once. Time and time again, marketers and ad people completely overestimate how often a brand is bought. People's contact with our brand is much more fleeting than we think. The language of fans sends us in the wrong direction. We're assuming people are buying us week in, week out. You know, shampoo is a fairly frequently bought category. And you will see this in category after category, and you'll say, yes, and what about cars? And I'll show you it's the same in cars, and it's the same in household durables. It is the same in every category. And there are your fans. That's what we've been trying to get. Let's get more fans. Why do you want to get more fans? They're not. I would like my competitors to be chasing fans because they'll cripple a company. They'll destroy a brand. They are not where the money is, and they're not where the future is. So you hear the rhetoric from many a person in marketing and ad land saying, fans buy more than the average consumer. Yes, Mr. Client, they do buy more than the average. There's just one of them, though. That's the other bit of the equation we've forgotten to have a look at. All the rhetoric of fans and relationships is just that, because nobody's had the time and interest just to look at buyer data. So never mind about, we're so busy as an industry talking about big data that we've forgotten to look at small data, easily available, that's on their desk, hopefully, of every marketeer in the land. So the fact of the matter is the health of your brand is not dependent on fans. It's dependent on lots of people who don't know you well, don't think of you very much, don't buy you very often, if at all. Not fans. So those people, these are the people we like to put in sort of sexy sort of planning decks and sort of state of the culture union presentations. These kinds of people fans generate publicity because they will talk about you, they will receive your content, they will be more inclined to distribute it through their social networks, but they are not revenue generators. So if you really want to fuck it up, I suggest that you confuse publicity generation with revenue generation. They are slightly different, they're slightly different effects, they are related, but your fans are not your most vital source of sales revenue. So, and I'd suggest then when it comes to fans, we stop treating them as the audience for our efforts and as actors in the dramas our brands create. They are a means to an end, but fans are not the destination you want to be driving your brand bus to unless you want to sort of drive it over a cliff. So, given fans a good kicking, let's talk about this other one, participation. We talk a lot about it's sort of wrapped up in the fuzzy, nebulous rhetoric of engagement, isn't it? The desire, we're told, I read, nobody wants to sit back anymore and passively consume marketing content. That the accessibility of technology and social tools and all the rest of it now lets consumers be part of the conversation and collaborate and co-create and all of that stuff, and sort of the interruptive model that assumed the consumer was just happy to sort of sit back and receive our content is fundamentally broken. I don't know, maybe they didn't have a look at some other Nielsen data. So, but I was heartened by the panel session this morning. So there was some good sense spoken in the context of sort of the suggestion that TV was dead. Passive consumption as a facet of human behavior, not just our interaction with brands and media, is not dead. We haven't all suddenly become much more sort of energized and productive human beings. A lot of the time we just like to sort of sit around and absorb stuff other people have done, like TV shows. So here we go. This is the aggregate consumption in the UK for the 12 months to May 2011. This is Barb data. Yeah, so this is panel data. Again, didn't make it up. This is observed consumption. What do we see? I mean, I know there's lots of other forms of interaction, but just as a sort of, toe in the water. Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn accounted for 182 million hours of people's time in the course of those 12 months. And TV, you know that thing that's dead, the thing that's that corpse out in the next room, 6.4 billion hours. Now, this isn't a plea for TV advertising, but as a symptom of human behavior, this says we still like to sit back, relax, and do nothing but absorb and enjoy. It hasn't suddenly become a completely, the pendulum hasn't swung completely in the favor of a sort of the lean forward culture. We're doing a bit of leaning forward, and we're doing a hell of a lot more leaning back still. I've never seen that chart in the prophecies of TV being dead. The facts are so inconvenient, aren't they? Sort of get in the way of rhetoric. Back to that. This is back to Facebook. I'm not giving Facebook a kicking. This is a commentary on the nature of human nature. Of 200 brands studied on Facebook, only one showed a level of engagement, as measured by people talking about, over 2%. What does that say? So much for a participative culture. It would seem that even self-declared fans are quite happy being a bit lazy and letting everybody else do the sharing, the liking, and the creating, and the posting. We've vastly over-exaggerated people's desire to participate. The market for laziness hasn't died. And when you look at people's digital participation, beyond just participation in the stuff we make, which is a very, very narrow lens on life, you see that people's digital participation and interactions is, amazingly, with each other, which is presumably why that stuff was invented in the first place. This was published earlier this year. It's a study by the BBC. The methodology is slightly opaque, but then you'd expect that from a bunch of journalists. So the purpose of this study was to try and validate what had largely been the theory of participation inequality that suggested there was sort of a vast amount of passive people, slightly more people being slightly more involved, and a very tiny number of population being active contributors and originators of content. So they wanted to see, was that true of our sort of newly digital culture? Perhaps not surprising. I mean, they found that sort of 20%, that was probably the biggest surprise, was quite how small that completely passive segment was. 17% of people were sort of intensely participating, either originating and creating their own content. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a large slab in the middle who are kind of in the middle. And when one looks at what they're doing, the people who are sort of at the extreme end of the easy spectrum, so to speak, what do you see? You see that digital participation is with each other. So this is status updates, commenting on each other's walls or what have you, and consuming TV, entertainment, and lifestyle content. So they're interacting with each other. Amazing. Yeah? It's a bit like the telephone conversation. It'd be weird now if clients said, we've noticed that people are making a lot of telephone calls to each other. We should be part of that. To which the answer is no. Just because people are participating with each other, dear brand, dear client, dear agency, doesn't mean they will want to participate with you in those forums and on those platforms. Yeah. So I think we've sort of vastly overestimated people's desire to participate with brands. People are much more into participating with each other, which I'd suggest is a lot more interesting. A short quote from an agency guy. And that ultimately, I think, one of the things we've lost sight of is that mass reaction to a brand's efforts is ultimately much more important than the number of people who actually participated in your content. Mass reaction is I'll take mass reaction over mass participation, because mass reaction is just easier to get. Things to think about. And this is probably a bit of an obvious one. So just sort of trying to get to strategies that don't completely fail. People won't find your content. I think this one should be sort of the most facile of my suggestions. The odds of, for example, it's so easy to trot out these stats, isn't it? The odds of people finding your content on YouTube unassisted is, to all intents and purposes, 0. It's just too damn much. The joke of the click-through rate. Some estimates, this estimate suggests that the click-through rate is 0.9%. I've seen lower ones. There was a study done a couple of months ago, I think, where some researchers created a blank banner ad with no content whatsoever. Absolutely blank. And the absolute joke is it's got a higher than average click-through rate. Extraordinary. A blank banner gets a higher than average click-through rate than the average branded content. Amazing. It's probably just like the absence of content now is so novel that people go, I wonder what's that? Empty space on my screen. That should really trouble us. And so it goes on. Almost 5,000 pieces of content sort of rushing through the hose of Facebook into your social life. That's a lot. Thank God for the algorithm. You all know the double rainbow viral nonsense, complete stoner marveling over a double rainbow. This is data from YouTube that demonstrates that actually that video had been on YouTube garnering no views whatsoever for months. No view. These things always seem inevitable in hindsight. There was no inevitability about that content going viral whatsoever. In fact, it was much more inevitable and much more likely that it would have never been seen, except famous American stand-up comedian Jimmy Kimmel tweeted about it and then talked about it on his TV show, i.e. somebody publicized the existence of that content, and then the thing went viral. So, the days of build us and they will come, I think, are long, long dead. But I think sort of smart channel planners and integrators have figured that one out. We're almost there. It sounds all a bit bleak, doesn't it? Light at the end of the tunnel. What? Nobody cares about what I do. They won't find it. They don't want to have a relationship with me. They don't want to take part. What do I do as a marketer? Don't kill yourselves yet. But just get a bit depressed a bit more. Depth. Depth is not more important than breadth. The rhetoric of engagement has taken some people's eyes off the ball. So back to our favorite distribution of purchase frequencies. Clearly the implication is that for continued health and indeed growth, brands depend on connecting with great big populations, not tiny niche populations that are generating lots and lots and lots of sales revenue. If you want to be like Fructus, if you want to be like Pantene, presumably we're all in the business of growth. you need some breadth. And again, what you go back to, I could bore you for hours with, the inconvenience of data. But the big difference between big brands and small brands is not how much loyalty they get, but how many people buy them. The fiction, so I'm not going to sort of embarrass the authors of an agency philosophy that suggests that you can garner loyalty beyond reason. It's nonsense. All brands get exactly the loyalty you'd expect given their size. It's entirely predictable. The difference between big brands and small brands is simply how many people buy you. Marketing is a game of scale. And if you're not scaling in marketing, then you're not marketing. Don't know what you're doing, and you probably don't either. So engagement, that sense of a sort of depth and active behavioral participation, has not replaced the necessity of reach. Reach is a considerably unsexier, much older concept, but it hasn't gone away. Not if you want to be big and not if you want to grow. And I personally would rather help my clients grow their business than rather sort of decimate them. So, it's all a bit bleak, isn't it? Right, let's try and sort of find some vestiges of good news in this. But the truth sets us free, because rhetoric sends some people down sort of rabbit holes of irrelevance. Here's the truth. Here's a personal point of view. Might be uncomfortable for us. We spend so much time, on those fucking conference calls and creative reviews and running to and fro meetings. You go, how can this be possible? If I spend so much of my time on this. However, it's not about our psychology. That's not the most important. It's about the psychology of the consumer out there that ultimately we should be concerning ourselves with. Much of what we put out there in the world, brands, marketing content, whatever you want to call it, is not vital to consumers, but in general, relatively, all things being relative, relatively trivial. Not irrelevant, relatively trivial. And it's relatively incidental. Most people are not wanting to have that intense relationship with you. It's incidental to this. My clicker works, there you go. It's incidental to this. And 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 this, and this, and this, and this, this, and this, and this, and this, and that. It's incidental to that. And what that is it's ordinary, awful, awesome, everyday life. That's what is occupying people. And our brands, relative to that, are tiny little things that sort of buzz around. And I think marketing needs to get back to that truth, that it's all that you saw. I stole these. Wall Street Journal does a wonderful week in the life, day in the life. And sends their photographers out and just goes, don't capture the big news stories, just go somewhere and take a picture of what's happening right now. Nobody's interacting with brands, just getting on with living and loving and dying and getting killed and all that sort of stuff. So, our brands are incidental to life. And I think we'd better wake up to the reality that there is no audience for what we make. Luckily, there was a pre-invited audience to what I had to make. But most of the time, we don't have that privilege as marketers. We don't have the luxury of sort of sending out sort of delegate passes and knowing that people will turn up. There is no audience for what we make, and that should not trouble us, because the knowledge that there is no audience actually demands that our creative standards finally get a little bit higher. Because our task unlike some people would have you think, is not nurturing the enthusiasm of the few. It is overcoming the indifference, the broad indifference of the many. Nurturing the enthusiasm of the few is easy. You just show them the logo of the brand they like, and they go, oh yeah, that's the brand I like. You don't have to do much. Overcoming the indifference of the many demands something quite different. And that should inspire, not depress us. Now, we should get excited that out there are millions of people who, broadly speaking, don't give a crap about what we make. Because the truth of the matter is, all creativity demands resistance. David's marble gave him resistance. The resistance of stone on chisel is the thing that liberated creativity. The knowledge that people don't care about what we make, or broadly indifferent, should get us to demand more of ourselves in terms of the creative output we put out there. If you go back to that earlier iTunes app, that awful execrable piece of sort of gamification, it assumed its audience was interested, and the result is crap. Now imagine if we'd assumed that that person didn't want our product and didn't want our game and wasn't broadly interested in Bleach. What could we then give her that would get her over the obstacle of indifference? I don't have an answer at this point. At this point, my sort of confidence runs out. I haven't got any answers, because it would be, it's easy to diagnose the problems and less easy, as somebody was saying earlier. There is no one solution, one size fits all. However, broad strokes, I'd argue, see, look at the seamless agenda here. Start with what is interesting to people, not with what is interesting to you as a marketeer. Second, I'd give more than I take. Whether I'm offering a piece of entertainment or a piece of utility, I would always give the consumer more than I take. If you insist on claiming that people have a relationship with the brand, you better give more than you take. I was always taught that a relationship was a place where you go to give, not a place where you go to take in real life. I don't know much about relationships, but that much I've learned. So give more than you take. And finally, I'd suggest that you want to sort of leap over that barrier of broad indifference and people not giving a crap. I'd suggest you sort of stop fiddling with your brand onions and not just take a position rather than just have a positioning, have a point of view. It's hard to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't have any opinions. Right. So see a little bit of emerging light there. You'll have to figure out your own solutions to the conquest of indifference. We've all got to find our own sort of muddled path to the promised land. But I can tell you, if you dispense with those sort of silly pieces of marketing rhetoric, the chances are you'll have a lot more success on your hands. So just to prove it's not all, just one piece of work. Not a case study. I'm just going to show you a TV commercial, but it's a lovely example of what happens when your starting point is what is important to the consumer in their life, not in their relationship to your category, but in their life. When you take it upon yourself the responsibility to, in that moment when you're trying to have a contact with your consumer, that you give them more than you're asking them to do, and that you have a point of view. So we all know Tide, one of the world's fabulous mega brands, and to the question that was asked in the panel earlier, probably not the brand that sort of every marketing trainee wants to work on, though they should. However, fairly dull category. It's not exactly sexy. There's a very short story about Procter & Gamble. And you go, but where's Procter & Gamble in that thing? It's on the back. There it is. That's the relationship that the consumer has with the corporate brand Procter & Gamble. That's the extent of knowledge that the consumer had if they could be bothered to read the back of a bottle. And I don't know what consumer in their right mind would repeatedly do that. That's the thing that we wanted to make relevant, interesting, capable of getting past the sort of the broad indifference in a fairly, unexciting category. So the only thing I've got to share with you is a bit of work that came out of not assuming that sort of people gave a shit. So can we just play the ad? You can't see it. So there you go. Yes, exactly. So we probably need to have a coffee break and all go and call our mothers immediately. I feel I need to. So just my parting sort of thought for what it's worth is once you start assuming that nobody out there cares, you start finding yourself doing much, much braver, much more exciting work. Thank you.